Jake Miller felt his stomach flip as the transport shuttle began its final approach to Zarian Prime. Through the small window next to his seat, he could see the planet's surface getting closer. The world looked like a giant crystal ball with blue and silver buildings that caught the light from two small suns in the sky. He pressed his face against the cool glass and watched as strange towers and domes grew larger below. This was really happening. He was about to become the first human student to join the Galactic Academy's exchange program. For the next 6 months, he would study with alien students from 12 different worlds. Jake shifted in his seat and felt the soft wool blanket tucked under his arm. His grandmother had knitted it for him when he was 7 years old. It was blue with small white stars, and it still smelled faintly like her house. His mother had told him to leave it at home before the trip, but Jake had packed it anyway. He knew it was silly, but the blanket always helped him sleep better. When he was nervous or in a new place, the shuttle touched down with a gentle thump on the landing pad. Jake took a deep breath and stood up with the other passengers. Most of them were adults on business trips or diplomatic missions. He was the only student on board, and definitely the youngest person there. "Welcome to Zarian Prime," announced the pilot's voice through the speakers. "Local time is 1400 hours. Temperature is a comfortable 22 degrees Celsius, and gravity is 0.95 standard. Thank you for flying with Galactic Transport Services." Jake grabbed his duffel bag from the overhead compartment and slung it over his shoulder. The blanket stayed tucked under his other arm as he walked down the aisle toward the exit. Some of the other passengers glanced at him with curiosity, probably wondering what a young human was doing on this world. The doors opened with a soft hiss, and Jake stepped out into the alien air. It tasted different than Earth air somehow, cleaner and sharper. The gravity felt almost normal, just a tiny bit lighter than home. The two suns in the sky cast everything in a strange, pale light that made colors look different. A group of students waited for him at the bottom of the shuttle ramp. Jake could tell right away that none of them were human. This was it. His first real meeting with alien classmates. The tallest one stepped forward. Jake had studied pictures of different alien species, so he recognized this one as a Vrexian. The alien looked like a giant insect that had learned to walk on 2 legs. His body was covered in shimmering purple armor-like skin, and his eyes were huge and made up of hundreds of tiny parts. 4 thin arms hung at his sides, and his head moved in quick, jerky motions like a bird. "Human student Jake Miller," the Vrexian said in a voice that sounded like clicking and buzzing. A small device on his chest translated his words into English. "I am Zephyr. Welcome to Zarian Prime and the Galactic Academy." "Thank you," Jake replied, trying not to stare at Zephyr's strange appearance. "I'm excited to be here." Another student floated forward. This one was completely different from the Vrexian. She looked like a cloud of glowing gas trapped inside a clear bubble. Her color shifted and changed as she moved, flowing from blue to green to purple. Jake knew this was an ethereal, a species that did not have solid bodies like humans. "I am Luminara," the ethereal said. Her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We have prepared living quarters for you in the student dormitory complex." A third student approached from the side. This one looked more like the dinosaurs Jake had seen in museums on Earth. He was covered in dark green scales that reflected the light from Zarian's twin suns. His head was long and narrow, and Jake could see sharp teeth when he spoke. A forked tongue flicked out briefly, tasting the air. "Human Jake," the reptilian student said. "I am Korath of the Saurian Republic. We are curious to observe your species' learning methods." Jake nodded at each of them, trying to remember their names and species. There were other students in the group too, but these 3 seemed to be the leaders. He noticed that several of them were looking at the blanket under his arm with what appeared to be confusion. Zephyr's compound, eyes focused on the blanket and his head tilted to one side in a very insect-like way. "Human Jake, what is that textile object you carry?" Jake felt his cheeks get warm. He had hoped nobody would notice the blanket right away. "Oh, this. It's just a blanket from home. Something to help me sleep better in a new place." The alien Students exchanged glances. Even though they were all very different species, Jake could tell they were all thinking the same thing. They found his blanket strange and probably funny. Luminara's gaseous form shifted to a pale yellow color. Jake had read that this color meant curiosity mixed with something like amusement for ethereals. Surely your human technology provides better temperature regulation systems than primitive woven materials? The dormitory buildings have advanced climate control, added Korath, his voice carrying a hint of what Jake interpreted as superiority. Each room can be adjusted to any temperature or humidity level desired by the occupant. Such ... accessories ... seem unnecessary for a species that claims to be technologically advanced. Jake felt his face get even warmer. He was starting to regret bringing the blanket, but he did not want to seem defensive on his first day. "I know it probably seems silly to you," he said with a small smile. "Different species probably have different ideas about what makes them comfortable." One of the other students, a being that looked like it was made of living metal, spoke up. "On my world, we simply adjust our internal temperature settings. Carrying external warming devices would be considered a sign of mechanical failure." Another student, whose species Jake did not recognize, made a sound that the translator interpreted as laughter. Perhaps humans are not as evolved as their reputation suggests. Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. He had been looking forward to this exchange program for months, and now he was starting it by being mocked for bringing something from home. He decided to change the subject. "Could you show me to the dormitory?" he asked. "I would like to get settled in before classes start tomorrow." "Of course," Zephyr replied, though Jake noticed that the Vrexian's eyes kept drifting back to the blanket. "Follow us, human Jake. We will give you a tour of the facility." As they walked across the crystalline surface toward the main campus buildings, Jake heard whispered conversations behind him. He could not understand the alien languages, but the tone was clear enough. They were talking about him and his blanket. The campus was beautiful in an alien way. The buildings were tall and curved, made of some kind of crystal or metal that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Students of various species moved along the walkways, some walking on legs like Jake, others floating or gliding through the air. The dormitory complex houses students from all member species of the Galactic Academy, Luminara explained as they walked. You will be sharing common areas with beings from many different worlds. Each species has specific environmental needs, Korath added. The building systems automatically adjust to provide optimal conditions for each individual. Jake nodded, trying to pay attention to the tour while also dealing with the embarrassment of his blanket situation. He had packed it without thinking, the same way he might pack a toothbrush or a favorite shirt. But now he was realizing that what seemed normal to him might seem primitive or childish to his alien classmates. They reached the dormitory building, which was even more impressive up close. The walls seemed to shimmer and change color as they approached, and Jake could see that the entrance doors were designed to accommodate beings of many different sizes and shapes. "Your room is on the 5th level," Zephyr announced. "Your roommate is an Aquarian named Splash. They are quite friendly and should help you adjust to life here." As they entered the building, Jake caught several more students staring at his blanket. Word was apparently already spreading about the human, who had brought a primitive textile to an advanced alien academy. Jake realized this was going to be a long 6 months. Jake's first week at the Galactic Academy passed in a blur of strange faces, alien languages, and confusing customs. Every morning he woke up in his narrow dormitory bed, and every morning he reached for his grandmother's blanket to wrap around his shoulders while he got dressed. It was a simple routine that helped him feel less homesick in this strange new world. His roommate Splash was kind enough. The Aquarian looked like a walking fish with arms and legs, and he had to wear a special breathing mask that covered his gills. Splash spoke in a bubbly, gurgling voice that reminded Jake of water flowing over rocks. Unlike the other students, Splash never made fun of Jake's blanket. "Different species, different needs," Splash would say whenever Jake apologized for taking up space with his blanket. "On my world, we carry comfort stones from our birth pools. Same idea, different material. But Splash was the only one who felt that way. As the days went by, Jake's blanket became a bigger and bigger source of entertainment for his alien classmates. It seemed like every time he pulled it out, someone had a new comment to make. During their first field study trip to the campus botanical gardens, Jake had packed his blanket in his backpack along with his notebooks and lunch. The gardens were filled with plants from dozens of different worlds, and the temperature was kept cooler than the dormitories to help preserve the more delicate species. When they stopped for a break near a grove of silver, trees from the Centauri system, Jake pulled out his blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. The other students immediately took notice. "Look, the human requires his comfort fabric again," Zephyr announced to the group in his clicking voice. Several of the other students made sounds that Jake had learned were their versions of laughter. A student named Quill, who belonged to a species that looked like walking crystals, chimed in with a voice like ringing bells. "Perhaps we should request that the Academy provide backup comfort fabrics for the human. In case his primary textile fails." Even some of the quieter students began to join in. A small furry creature named Pip squeaked, "My species abandoned such primitive warming methods thousands of years ago. We simply grew better fur." Jake tried to ignore the comments and focus on his study materials, but it was hard to concentrate when everyone around him was discussing his blanket. Like it was some kind of museum exhibit. The situation got worse. In their advanced atmospheric sciences class, Professor Valdris was an ancient being who looked like a walking mountain of purple crystal. Her voice echoed from inside her mineral body, and she had a habit of using student examples to explain complex concepts. "Class, today we will discuss adaptive versus maladaptive behaviors in technological species," Professor Valdris announced during one lecture. Her crystal form pulsed with different colors as she spoke. "Observe how certain species develop psychological dependencies on physical objects that serve no practical purpose in modern environments." Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized where this was going. "The human student's attachment to woven materials demonstrates what we call evolutionary lag," the professor continued. "When a species develops technology that makes old survival methods unnecessary, individuals sometimes maintain these behaviors anyway. This is an example of primitive evolutionary traits persisting in an advanced civilization." Jake slumped down in his seat as every other student in the class turned to look at him. He could feel his face burning with embarrassment. The professor was using him as an example of primitive behavior in front of the entire class. Zephyr raised one of his thin arms. "Professor, does this mean that humans are less evolved than other galactic species?" "Not less evolved," Professor Valdris replied, "but perhaps more attached to their ancestral behaviors. This is not uncommon among species that achieve space travel relatively recently." Jake wanted to disappear into the floor. He had come to this academy to learn about alien cultures and represent humanity well. Instead, he was being used as an example of human backwardness. The mockery spread beyond his immediate classmates. During lunch periods in the massive cafeteria, Jake would often hear whispered conversations at other tables. Students from species he had never even met knew about the human with the comfort blanket. One afternoon, while Jake was eating alone at a corner table, a group of older students approached him. They were all from different species, but they had the confident swagger that Jake recognized from popular kids at his high school back on Earth. "So you're the human who brought a blanket to space," said their leader, a tall, blue-skinned being with 4 arms. "We heard about you from our younger classmates." Jake looked up from his meal. "Yes, I brought a blanket. Is that a problem?" "Not a problem," the blue student replied with a smile that showed too many teeth. "Just interesting. We run a small betting pool about which species will show the most primitive behaviors during field studies. You've made several of us quite wealthy." Another student in the group, whose species Jake didn't recognize, added, "We're taking bets on whether you'll bring the blanket to the survival training exercise next month. The odds are quite good if you want to place a wager yourself." Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting into a fight on his second week would not help his situation. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. The group moved on, but Jake could hear them laughing as they walked away. He was becoming a joke to the entire academy. Even the library, which should have been a quiet place to study, became uncomfortable. Jake liked to wrap his blanket around his shoulders while he read, especially when he was working on difficult assignments. But other students would point and whisper when they saw him. Some even took pictures with their various recording devices. One evening, while Jake was studying for an upcoming test on interspecies communication, Korath approached his table. The reptilian student's scales gleamed under the library's soft lighting. "Human Jake," Korath said, settling into a chair across from him. "I've been thinking about your blanket situation." Jake looked up from his textbook. "What about it?" "My species has a concept called thermal dignity," Korath explained. "It means that intelligent beings should be able to regulate their body temperature through will and biological adaptation, not through external aids. Your blanket represents a lack of thermal dignity." "I see," Jake replied, though he didn't really understand why his blanket was such a big deal to everyone. "I am not trying to insult you," Korath continued. "I am simply curious about why humans cling to such primitive methods when superior technology exists. Every building on this campus has perfect climate control. Your dormitory room can be adjusted to any temperature you desire. Why do you still need that blanket?" Jake thought about the question for a moment. How could he explain that the blanket wasn't really about temperature? It was about feeling safe and comfortable in a strange place, about having something familiar, when everything else was alien and confusing. "It's not just about being warm," Jake said finally. "It's about comfort, feeling at home." Korath's head tilted to one side. "But you are not at home. You are here, in a place with better technology and more advanced systems than your homeworld. Why would you want to feel like you are in a less advanced place?" Jake didn't have a good answer to that question. Maybe Korath was right. Maybe he was being primitive and silly. Maybe he should put the blanket away and try to fit in better with his classmates. But that night, alone in his dormitory room, Jake still wrapped the blanket around himself before going to sleep. Splash gurgled softly from his own bed, which was filled with special water from his homeworld. "Don't listen to them," Splash said in the darkness. "Comfort is not primitive. It is necessary." Jake smiled in the dark, grateful for at least one friend who understood. But he wondered how much longer he could endure the constant mockery. The semester was just beginning, and he already felt like giving up. Little did he know that everything was about to change. Jake was having the strangest dream. He was back home on Earth, sitting in his grandmother's kitchen while she made hot chocolate. But something was wrong. The kitchen kept getting colder and colder, and his grandmother's voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. She was trying to tell him something important, but he couldn't understand the words. A loud, piercing sound cut through the dream and yanked Jake back to consciousness. His eyes snapped open to find his dormitory room flashing with amber emergency lights. The sound was coming from speakers in the ceiling, a harsh alarm that made his ears hurt. "Attention all students and faculty," a mechanical voice announced in multiple languages. "This is not a drill. Please remain calm and listen carefully for important safety information." Jake sat up in his bed, instantly awake. Across the room, Splash was already moving, his aquatic form more alert than Jake had ever seen him. The aquarian was pulling on his emergency breathing gear with quick, practiced movements. "Jake, get dressed quickly," Splash gurgled through his mask. "Emergency. Alarms only sound for very serious problems." Jake threw off his blanket and grabbed his clothes from the chair next to his bed. As he dressed, he could hear doors opening and closing in the hallway outside. Other students were talking in worried voices, their various alien languages mixing together into a confused babble. "Zarian Prime is experiencing a critical atmospheric failure," the announcement continued. "The primary atmospheric processor has suffered a catastrophic malfunction. All students and faculty must report to designated emergency shelters immediately." Jake's heart started beating faster. Atmospheric failure sounded very bad, even though he wasn't exactly sure what it meant. He pulled on his shoes and grabbed his student identification card from his desk. "What's an atmospheric processor?" he asked Splash as they headed for the door. "It's the machine that controls our weather and air," Splash explained, his voice tight with worry. "If it breaks down, the planet can't maintain safe conditions for life." They joined the stream of students flowing out of the dormitory building. The hallways were full of beings from dozens of different species, all moving with the same urgent purpose. Jake recognized some of his classmates in the crowd, but nobody was making jokes or casual conversation. Everyone looked scared. Outside, the sky looked wrong. The two suns of Zarian Prime were still shining, but the air felt different. Jake could taste something metallic and sharp with each breath, and the wind was starting to pick up. In the distance, he could see dark clouds gathering on the horizon. "Students, over here!" called a familiar clicking voice. Jake turned to see Zephyr waving his 4 arms to get their attention. The Vrexian was standing near the main academic building with several other students from their xenobiology class. Jake and Splash hurried over to the group. Even in the crisis, Jake noticed that several of his classmates glanced at the blanket tucked under his arm. He had grabbed it automatically when leaving his room, the same way he might grab his wallet or keys. "Human Jake," Korath said as they approached. The reptilian student's scales were a duller color than usual, which Jake had learned meant he was stressed or frightened. "Do you understand what is happening?" "Not really," Jake admitted. Splash said the atmospheric processor controls the weather. Luminara's gaseous form was shifting rapidly between different colors, cycling through blues and purples and grays. "It is much more serious than just weather," she said, her voice carrying a tremor that Jake had never heard before. "The processor doesn't just control weather. It controls the entire atmosphere of the planet." Professor Valdris appeared at the entrance to the academic building, her crystal form pulsing with urgent red light. She was moving faster than Jake had ever seen her move, which was saying something for a being made of living rock. "Students, gather around me immediately," she commanded. "The situation is more serious than the initial announcements indicated." The crowd of students pressed closer to the professor. Jake found himself standing next to Quill, the crystal student who had made fun of his blanket during the field trip. For once, Quill wasn't making any jokes. "The atmospheric processor failure has caused a cascade effect in our planetary weather control systems," Professor Valdris explained. "Multiple backup systems are failing faster than our engineers expected. The planet's temperature is dropping rapidly." A student near the back of the crowd called out, "How rapidly, Professor?" Professor Valdris's crystal form flashed brighter red. "Current projections show temperatures falling to -80 degrees Celsius within the next 6 hours. Jake felt his stomach drop. -80 degrees was colder than Antarctica in winter. It was cold enough to freeze most liquids solid. It was cold enough to kill. A collective gasp arose from the assembled students. Even species that came from cold worlds looked frightened by that number. Jake saw several students begin to shake, and not just from the wind that was picking up around them. "Professor, what about the heating systems in the buildings?" asked a student Jake didn't recognize. "Surely we can wait inside until the repairs are finished. The same power grid failure that damaged the atmospheric processor is affecting all building systems," Professor Valdris replied. "We cannot guarantee that indoor heating will remain functional." "Then what do we do?" Zephyr asked, his compound eyes reflecting the emergency lights. "We must reach the emergency shelters in the lower levels of the campus," Professor Valdris said. "They are built into the bedrock and have independent power systems. They should be able to maintain safe temperatures even if the main power grid fails completely." The professor began moving toward a staircase that Jake had never noticed before. It was built into the side of the academic building and seemed to lead down into the ground. "Follow me quickly," she commanded. "We must reach the shelters before the temperature drops below survivable levels for warm-blooded species." As they walked, Jake noticed that the wind was getting stronger and colder. He could see his breath forming small clouds in the air, something that had never happened on Zarian Prime before. Around him, his classmates were beginning to show signs of distress. The insect-like students were moving more slowly as their metabolism responded to the dropping temperature. The ethereals were condensing their gaseous forms into smaller, more concentrated shapes. Even the reptilian students like Korath were beginning to look sluggish. "Human Jake," Luminara called out as they walked. Her voice was fainter than usual, and her colors were shifting to deep blues and purples. "I must apologize for our earlier behavior." "What do you mean?" Jake asked, though he suspected he knew. "Your blanket," she said, her form flickering weakly. "We mocked you for bringing a primitive warming method. But now now it seems less primitive." Jake looked down at the blanket under his arm. It was just a simple piece of cloth, knitted by his grandmother's hands. But suddenly, it felt much more important than it had that morning. "We may have underestimated the value of your approach," Korath added, his voice slower than usual. "Your species' tendency to prepare for temperature variations. It may be more advanced than we realized." The group reached the entrance to the emergency shelters. It was a heavy metal door built into the hillside, with thick walls that looked like they could withstand anything. Professor Valdris pressed her crystal hand against a scanner, and the door slowly opened. "Inside, quickly," she urged. "The temperature has already dropped 15 degrees in the past hour." As they filed into the shelter, Jake realized that everything was about to change. The same classmates who had spent weeks making fun of his blanket were now looking at him with new understanding. What had seemed like a joke just hours ago was now a matter of survival, but Jake also realized that his one blanket, no matter how warm and comforting, would not be enough to help 43 alien students survive the next 6 hours. The real test was just beginning. The emergency shelter looked like something from a science fiction movie. The walls were made of thick metal that curved in a gentle dome shape above their heads. Emergency lights cast everything in a harsh white glow, and the air smelled like recycled oxygen and fear. Jake counted 44 beings packed into the shelter, including himself. Students from 12 different species huddled together in groups, their various body types creating strange shadows on the metal walls. The space was designed to hold everyone in an emergency, but it felt cramped and cold. Professor Valdris moved to a control panel near the entrance and began pressing buttons with her crystal fingers. The panel beeped and flashed, but the sounds it made did not seem encouraging. "Professor, is everything working correctly?" asked Dr. Helix, a mechanical being who served as the Academy's chief engineer. His metal body sparked occasionally as he worked at another control station across the room. "The basic life support systems are functioning," Professor Valdris replied, but her voice carried a note of concern. "However, the heating systems are drawing more power than expected." Dr. Helix's metal head turned toward her with a grinding sound. "How much more power?" "Enough that we have a problem," she answered. "The backup power supply cannot handle both." The air recycling system and the heating system at full capacity. Jake felt his stomach clench. Even he could understand what that meant. They had to choose between breathing and staying warm. "How long can the power supply last if we run both systems?" Splash asked from beside Jake. The Aquarian's breathing mask was fogging up, which Jake had learned meant he was very nervous. Dr. Helix worked at his control panel for several seconds before answering. "Approximately 2 hours with both systems, at current usage levels." "And if we turn off the heating system?" Professor Valdris asked. "The air recycling system alone can run for approximately 18 hours. Professor Valdris's crystal form pulsed with different colors as she considered their options. "How long until rescue ships can reach us?" "Initial estimates suggest 12 to 14 hours, Dr. Helix replied. "The storm system created by the atmospheric failure is interfering with transport operations." The math was simple and terrifying. They could have air for 18 hours, but they could only have heat for 2 hours. After that, they would have to choose between suffocating and freezing to death. Jake looked around the shelter at his classmates. The temperature was already noticeably colder than when they had first entered. He could see his breath more clearly. Now, and several of the students were starting to shiver. The Vrexians were the first to show serious effects from the cold. Zephyr and the other insect-like students were moving very slowly, their complex eyes beginning to frost over. Jake remembered from his xenobiology classes that insect-based species became sluggish in cold temperatures. "Zephyr, are you okay?" Jake asked, moving closer to his classmate. The Vrexian's voice was slow and thick when he answered. "Human Jake. My species does not handle cold well. Our metabolism slows down when temperature drops. Luminara was having similar problems. Her gaseous form was condensing into a much smaller, denser shape. The bright colors that usually flowed through her body were fading to dull blues and grays. Cannot INTIN. Full form, she managed to communicate, her voice barely audible. Energy conservation necessary. Even the reptilian students were struggling. Korath had curled up in a corner of the shelter, his scales losing their usual shine. His forked tongue flicked out much more slowly than normal, and his eyes were beginning to look glassy. "Human," Korath called weakly. "Your blanket it seems less primitive now." Jake looked down at the blue wool blanket in his hands. It was just one blanket, barely big enough to cover himself, let alone 43 other students. But for the first time since arriving at the academy, his classmates were looking at it with respect instead of mockery. "I wish I had brought more," Jake said honestly. "This one won't help everyone." Quill, the crystal student who had made jokes about Jake's comfort fabric, spoke up from across the shelter. His voice had a brittle quality that Jake had never heard before. "Human Jake, my species can survive cold better than most organic beings. But even we have limits, perhaps your primitive methods are not so primitive after all." Professor Valdris was still working at the control panel, trying different combinations of settings. "I am reducing the heating system to minimum levels," she announced. "This will extend our power supply, but temperatures will continue to drop." As if to prove her point, a visible shiver ran through the group of students. Jake wrapped his blanket around his own shoulders and immediately felt guilty. The warmth felt wonderful, but everyone else was getting colder by the minute. "How cold? Will it get in here?" asked Pip, the small furry student who had once bragged about her species' superior fur. Now that superior fur was covered in frost, and she was shaking uncontrollably. "Without heating, the shelter temperature will eventually match the outside temperature," Dr. Helix replied. "Current projections show minus 70 degrees Celsius within 4 hours. Several students made sounds of despair in their various languages. Jake might not have understood the words, but the meaning was clear. They were all going to freeze to death. Jake looked around the shelter again, studying the faces of his classmates. These were the same beings who had spent weeks making fun of him for bringing a simple blanket from home. They had called him primitive and backward. They had used him as an example of human weakness, but now they were all in the same situation. Cold, scared, and running out of time, Splash moved closer to Jake, his aquatic body shivering inside his breathing suit. "Jake, you have the only warming device in this shelter. What do you think we should do?" The question surprised Jake. For weeks, nobody had asked for his opinion about anything. He had been the primitive human with the silly blanket. Now, suddenly, his classmates were looking to him for answers. "I don't know," Jake admitted. "My blanket isn't big enough for everyone." "Maybe we could share it somehow, take turns?" "That would only delay the inevitable," said a student Jake didn't know well, whose species looked like walking plants. "We need a solution that helps everyone, not just one person at a time." Jake stared at his blanket, thinking hard. There had to be something they could do. Humans had survived in cold environments for thousands of years before they had advanced technology. There had to be some basic principle he could apply here. "What other materials do we have in here?" Jake asked suddenly. Dr. Helix gestured around the shelter. "Emergency supplies include basic tools, some food packages, water, and various safety equipment. Why do you ask?" "Well," Jake said, his mind racing, "if we don't have enough blankets, maybe we can make more." Or at least make what we have work better. Professor Valdris's crystal form brightened slightly. Explain your thinking, human Jake. Jake stood up, still wearing his blanket like a cape. On Earth, humans learned to survive cold by working together. We shared body heat, we used multiple layers, we built shelters within shelters. Maybe we can do something similar here. For the first time since the emergency began, Jake saw hope in some of his classmates' faces. Even Zephyr managed to lift his frost-covered head to look at him. What do you propose? Korath asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked around the shelter one more time, calculating distances and possibilities. We need to think like humans, he said. Not like advanced spacefaring species with perfect technology. We need to think like people who only have basic materials in each other. The shelter fell silent except for the sound of the ventilation system and 44 beings breathing in the cold air. Everyone was waiting to hear what the primitive human with the comfort blanket would suggest next. Jake stood in the middle of the freezing shelter, looking at 43 alien students who were all staring back at him with hope in their eyes. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than his grandmother's blanket on his shoulders. Okay, he said, taking a deep breath that came out as a white cloud. First, I need to know what we're working with. Everyone, check your pockets, your bags, anything you brought with you. We need every piece of fabric, every cover, anything that can help with insulation. The students began searching through their belongings. Even though they were from different species with different needs, most of them had brought some kind of personal items to the academy. Splash was the first to contribute. He pulled a large towel from his breathing equipment bag. I use this to dry my gills, he gurgled. You can have it. Quill produced a silvery sheet from her pack. This is a meditation cloth from my homeworld. It is designed to reflect energy. 1. By one, the other students began offering items. Zephyr had a thin ceremonial cloak that he wore during important Vrexian holidays. Pip had a small blanket she used during her molting periods. Even Korath had a leather-like covering that served as a prayer mat for his species. Good, Jake said, gathering the materials in the center of the shelter. Now, the second thing we need to understand is that we're not just trying to stay warm. Individually, we need to work as a group. Dr. Helix looked up from his control panel. Explain what you mean, human Jake. Jake knelt down next to the pile of fabrics and began spreading them out. When humans lived in cold places without modern technology, we learned that body heat works better when it's shared. One person alone loses heat quickly, but a group of people together can stay much warmer. He began examining each piece of fabric, feeling their texture and thickness. We're going to create what my species calls a communal shelter. A warm space inside this cold space. How? Luminara asked weakly, her gaseous form now compressed into a space barely larger than Jake's head. Jake began tearing his grandmother's blanket into long strips. Several students gasped as they watched him destroy what they now understood was his most precious possession. Jake, no, Splash protested. That's your comfort blanket. It's more useful this way, Jake replied, continuing to tear the wool into strips. We're going to use these strips to connect all of our materials together. We'll make one big cover instead of many small ones. He showed Zephyr how to weave the strips of wool through the edges of the different fabrics. Your people are good with detailed work, right? Can you help me connect these pieces? Even though the cold was making him sluggish, Zephyr's compound eyes focused on the task. His four thin arms moved carefully, weaving the strips through the various materials. Yes, human Jake, I see the pattern you are creating. Other students began to help. Pip used her small, nimble fingers to tie knots. Quill's crystal form could cut clean edges where needed. Even Korath, moving slowly due to the cold, helped by holding pieces in place. As they worked, Jake explained his plan. We're going to set up this big cover like a tent in the corner of the shelter. Then we all get underneath it together. Our combined body heat will warm the air inside, and the multiple layers will keep that warm air from escaping. Professor Valdris watched the students working together. Human Jake, this is essentially creating a microenvironment within our existing environment. Exactly, Jake said, surprised that he was teaching a professor. Humans call it layered defense. You don't rely on just one thing to keep you warm. You use many things working together. Luminara's form flickered with curiosity. But our species are so different. We have different body temperatures, different heat output. How can we share warmth effectively? Jake had been thinking about this. Problem, that's actually an advantage. The mechanical students like Dr. Helix generate heat from their internal systems. The ethereals can expand to fill spaces and trap warm air. The organic species all produce body heat. We just need to arrange everyone in the right positions. They began setting up the improvised shelter in the warmest corner of the emergency shelter. Jake used his knowledge of his classmates' biology to organize the arrangement. Dr. Helix, can you position yourself near the center? Your internal systems will work like a heater for everyone else. The mechanical being moved into position, his metal body already radiating warmth from his power systems. Luminara, can you expand your form to fill the gaps between other students? You can help trap the warm air. The ethereal student slowly began to spread her gaseous form throughout the space under their improvised tent. Everyone else, we need to huddle close together. I know this might feel strange, since your species aren't used to physical contact, but body heat only works if we share it. The students began moving under the large cover they had created. It was cramped and awkward at first. Beings who had evolved on different worlds, with different concepts of personal space, were now pressed together in a small area. This feels very strange, Korath muttered. But Jake noticed that the reptilian student was already looking less sluggish. Strange but warmer, added Pip, her fur beginning to lose its frost as she curled up next to one of the mechanical students. Jake arranged himself near the edge of the group, making sure everyone else was positioned for maximum warmth. He could immediately feel the difference. The air under their improvised tent was noticeably warmer than the rest of the shelter. It's working, Splash gurgled with excitement. The temperature under here is at least 10 degrees warmer than outside. Professor Valdris, who had been monitoring the shelter's systems, made an announcement that filled everyone with hope. Students, I am detecting a significant decrease in the rate of heat loss in your section of the shelter. Your improvised warming system appears to be highly effective. Over the next few hours, the improvised shelter became more than just a survival tool. It became a place where 44 students from different worlds learned to work together in ways they never had before. Zephyr used his 4 arms to help adjust the fabric covering when cold air leaked in. Quill's crystal form helped reflect heat back into the group. The organic students shared stories from their homeworlds to help pass the time and keep their minds off the cold. Human Jake, Korath said at one point, his voice much stronger than it had been hours earlier. My species has a concept called survival wisdom. It means understanding that intelligence is not just about advanced technology, but about knowing how to adapt and survive with whatever resources are available. You have shown us that humans possess great survival wisdom, Luminara added. Her form now brighter and more colorful than it had been since the emergency began. Dr. Helix, whose mechanical body was serving as their central heating source, spoke up from the middle of the group. I have been calculating the efficiency of this improvised warming system. It is remarkable. You have increased our survival time by approximately 600% using only materials that were already available. Jake felt proud but also humble. My grandmother always said that humans are at their best when they take care of each other. I guess that applies to taking care of alien friends too. When the rescue ships finally arrived 14 hours later, they found something unexpected in the emergency shelter. Instead of 44 individual students suffering alone in the cold, they discovered a unified group working together under an ingenious shelter system, warm and safe. The incident became famous throughout the Galactic Academy system. Jake's improvised survival technique was studied in survival courses on dozens of worlds. More importantly, no alien student ever again mocked a human for bringing simple, practical items from home, but for Jake, the most important result was simpler. When they all returned to their regular dormitories, Zephyr knocked on his door with a gift, a beautiful ceremonial cloak from the Vrexian homeworld. "For your next adventure," Zephyr clicked in his translated voice, one primitive being to another. Jake smiled and accepted the gift. He had learned that sometimes the most advanced thing you can do is remember the simple wisdom of those who came before you,